Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. This month, we'll explore issues that relate to poverty and housing, and we'll explore how we can solve some of the problems through state legislative action. The Washington State Legislature convened in mid-January, and it will go through mid-March of this year. All year long, people can study issues and work with organizations and work with legislators to devise solutions to the problems. The state legislative sessions early in the year are a way to focus attention and work on the top priorities. The fruits that may be harvested during the legislative session actually have been cultivated for quite some time in many cases. Well, I'm happy to welcome two guests who can help inform us about what some of the issues are for this legislative session dealing with poverty and housing. They know a lot and they do a lot in our community to make the community a better place to live. We have Monica Peabody and Pat Tassoni. It's good to have you both here.
Thanks.
Monica works with Parents Organization for Welfare and Economic Rights, and that abbreviation is POWER. This is a new entity that replaces the Olympia Welfare Rights Organizing Coalition, ROC, that some of you may be familiar with. And Monica had provided really outstanding leadership for that organization, and now POWER is carrying on in the greater Olympia area. Pat Tassoni works with the Thurston County Tenants Union, which provides a lot of practical information and help for renters and with advocacy on issues of concern to renters and beyond. So good. It's good to have you both here. We'll be kind of bouncing back throughout the program. I want to start by checking in to see what is it that people actually receive in the way of a cash benefit from welfare. The public somehow has this notion that people get rich on welfare, and we just got to, debunk that one right at the outset. What's a welfare grant amount now?
Well, the welfare grant amount currently is incredibly low. A TANF grant, which is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, which is the grant that parents who have dependent children can receive when they need income support for a variety of reasons, is at 40% of the poverty level. There hasn't been an increase in the TANF grant for 15 years. The legislature has just ignored this responsibility. And whereas state workers, a lot of people get cost of living increases each year as the economy and things get more expensive. This hasn't happened for 15 years. And so I have a teenage daughter, and when she was a baby, I received it was AFDC back then, but a welfare grant, and it was $440 a month. And I was living in Seattle, and at that time you could find a studio apartment for around $400. So it didn't leave me a lot of money to buy other basic needs that I needed through the month, but I could barely get by. Today, there aren't $400 studio apartments, and it's just relegating people to intense poverty, families. 2/3 of welfare recipients are children, and I don't think they deserve this.
Mm-hmm. And a single person, there's a program called GAU as general assistance for people who are unemployable because they have a temporary disability or a temporary mental disability, physical or mental. What's the GAU grant for one person now?
It's in the same fee schedule. It's $339 a month for a person who's disabled and can't work. And so it's also doesn't provide enough to cover basic expenses. Basic expenses for a family of 3 are a lot more than a welfare grant for a family of 3. A welfare grant is $546, and basic expenses are up around $2,000.
Yeah. I remember in the 1960s and 70s, DSHS and the predecessor agency before DSHS came around in about 1971, they used to calculate a need standard based on, well, for a kid this age or for an adult, you need this amount for food, this amount for clothing, this amount for this and this and this. And the assistance grants at that time were based sort of on that.
Yeah.
And it's been unhinged. The rates have been unhinged from that, and it's just politics, and it's how the legislature balances the budget by cutting poor people.
Exactly.
And it's like you say, it's less than half the poverty standard.
40%, yeah. So it's
yeah.
it's dreadfully low. And in the 1970s, it was 100%,
Yeah.
and the expectation was that that's where it would be. And there's been a real campaign against welfare.
Yeah. It's a campaign against poor people is what it amounts to. But there's another issue. So part of what you want to do in the legislative session is to get those levels increased something, because they haven't been for 15 years.
And, even starting with a small increase that's tied to a cost of living index would help. Anything would help.
And then there's another priority issue that also relates to folks receiving assistance, and that's the state law limits welfare to only those people who have very, very little in the way of assets. And there's a House Bill 2897 that would allow for more assets in order to still qualify. Tell us what that's going.
Well, to qualify for welfare, you have to become completely impoverished. And that includes not having a car that's worth more than $5,000, not having any sort of savings account. And so you have to get rid of all your assets, and then you're plunged into this, pit of poverty where you're not even getting enough to get through the month. And it takes, to climb out of a hole like that, it takes a lot, and it's very difficult for people to become self-sufficient with no help. And if we had welfare be dependent on people's current income, as opposed to what kind of car they drove, they wouldn't have to sell their car to spend that money down to the point where they can qualify for welfare. They would have a good car to look for work. I mean, it just makes sense. People are self-sufficient when more of their needs are met.
Yeah. Well,
it doesn't make sense. They can't eat their car.
Yeah, well, or like you mentioned, savings account. The savings account maximum is so low that if you want to move someplace, you need to pay first and last month's rent and a damage deposit, and that's more than what you're allowed to have. So it's sort of like a recipe for homelessness.
And you can't even rent something on what the welfare grant is, so you have no nest egg to kind of supplement that at all.
Yeah. So there is that attempt to allow to raise the maximum level of assets that a person can have and still be able to qualify.
It wouldn't cost taxpayers any more money, and we believe that it would actually save money because people would be able to leave assistance for self-sufficiency sooner.
Right. Because if you get dug into that pit too deep, it makes it harder to climb out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Pat, you've got some priorities you're working on for housing-related things. Tell us about one of them.
Well, one is to keep renters in housing for as long as they can. Like a lot of people that we've been talking about either on TANF or on GAU who get limited income, they cycle in and out of homelessness, and where they cycle in and out of homelessness is in rental housing oftentimes. A lot of GAU recipients spend their $339 to stay in a hotel for the first 2 weeks of the month, and then they wind up homeless again because they're out of money. And some of them are able to pool their money together, get into a rental housing, and maintain it for a couple of months until their expenses expend their income, and so they wind up homeless again. And so that's just kind of the pit of where people climb out of homelessness is into rental housing, and there's different sort of incentives to make sure that they maintain that housing through cash subsidies or through better rates for tenants, so landlords can't arbitrarily either refuse to rent to them or in fact kick them out once they're in the housing.
And so there's some legislative
Yeah,
solution?
There's a number of legislative solutions. One is, for us, is the tenants union is what's called source of income discrimination protection, where a landlord cannot refuse to accept a state or federal housing subsidy, which is the government giving a poor person, oftentimes a homeless person, a voucher saying, use this voucher will cover 2/3 of your rent. And then the private market landlord saying, no, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to deal with you. You know, I don't want the money. I want to get money for my rental, but I don't want that kind of money. You know, and money's money from my perspective, and it gives people housing. And the other thing is landlords also refuse, in that case, not only just vouchers, but also payment from churches, from government entities, from nonprofits to supplement a borderline tenant's rent in order to keep them in that housing so they don't get evicted for non-payment of rent.
Is there some other legislative priority that you're especially concerned about?
Well, the other thing is, along with maximizing the current existing private rental marketplace, is to build more rental units. And it kind of goes hand in hand because there's already not enough private rental marketplace units available, and so we want to build more. And
At an affordable rate.
At an affordable rate.
If you're rich, you'll always find a place.
Right. And so, like, there's lots of legislation to get nonprofits to build affordable housing units that will be affordable for 10 years, 50 years for people, rather than just, you know, you get your quick tax break and then you turn around in you flip it into a condo in, 3 months or something.
For quite a few years, the price of rent has been, well, the price of any housing, whether you're buying or renting, has been increasing at a much faster rate than wages, especially low-end wages. The disparity between the rate of, if I could draw a graph with my hand, you know, the cost of housing, whether renting or buying, and then versus wages. Can you tell us some more about that disparity between wages and rent?
Well, every year, out of Washington, D.C., this group, I think it's called the Low Income Housing Institute.
I think so.
They do a study, and they track every county in the U.S., and there's no county in the U.S. that anybody who works a minimum wage job can afford a market rate rental. And so what that means here in Thurston County, Olympia area, is the minimum wage for somebody to make working full-time to afford a regular one-bedroom apartment would be $14.14, which is nearly twice the minimum wage here. And that's based on what's called a housing affordability, like you mentioned earlier, goes back to the 50s and 60s when the idea was 1/3 of your income should be spent on housing, and then you would have the 2/3 to spend on food, on clothing, on entertainment, and transportation issues. And so somebody spending 1/3 of their income on rent would have to make over $14 an hour.
And we have the highest, minimum wage in the
That's right.
nation, but
Right.
it's obviously not coming close to providing basic needs. And I think one of the ways to address that legislatively is to get behind living wage campaigns. And Representative Mark Malosha has been working on a living wage campaign for a couple of years now, and he's very determined to do something about poverty.
Can you tell us about the concept of a living wage?
Well, living wage would, and it bit by bit require government agencies, and then maybe move into the private sector, requiring employers to provide a living wage as opposed to a minimum wage.
A wage that you can actually live on.
Yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps based on that kind of, some kind of criteria or standard like we were talking about, rather than just on the politics of how cheap can we get away with on a minimum.
Yeah, and he has current legislation, so people can support it right now.
Okay. Do you have a bill number handy?
Yeah,
or?
House Bill 1118.
Okay. Okay, and that's to support a living wage.
A living wage.
Yeah, okay. When we were preparing for the program, both of you raised issues about the subprime lending, and the news media have been talking about subprime lending, and I wonder if you could explain what the concept is of that, what the issue is, what the crisis is, and then implications for lower income people in the state.
Well, from my perspective, one thing to understand is with the building industry, they're not there to build affordable units so people can have a decent place to live. They want to maximize their own profits and development. And similarly, like with subprime lending, it's not about making quality mortgage loans to people. It's about aggregating those loans together and selling them on the market and making money off of those loans as an asset, totally separate from the people that have underwritten it and their mortgages are on the line. And so the subprime mortgage concept is duping people into overextending their own abilities to repay the mortgage so that eventually they get foreclosed on, and the real industry, the mortgage lenders themselves and the people they sell the loans to benefit in the short term, like a 2-year period or so. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see has happened here far more than in the past.
So they've been making loans to people who don't have a good enough credit rating to qualify in the sense of being able to get a regular kind of mortgage.
Right.
They get some kind of a special deal, right. But they're being, like you said, duped. They're kind of suckering people in to get over their heads.
Well, they're starting with, they do the loans that increase in interest rate, and so they just keep going up and up until somebody is pushed out of their home because they can no longer afford the mortgage.
So low teaser rate to start from.
Exactly. And
no down payment.
And there's actually a bonus for financial workers who move people into the higher interest. When they refinance, they move them into a higher interest loans. And there's simple legislative fixes. I mean, there's even a bill proposed that would get rid of that bonus. Mm-hmm. So it's no longer an incentive to do that.
Well, for starting with the Great Depression, we used to have regulations in this country that would regulate the banking industry, the stock market, various kinds of investments, and so forth. And over the years, especially from the Reagan era and beyond, since the Reagan era, politicians have kind of been fooled by the free market, radicals in the free market mentality to get rid of regulations. Mm-hmm. And so they kind of brought this on themselves, and now more and more mainstream banks have been buying those aggregated mortgages like you were talking about. Mm-hmm. And so it's mainstream banks that are getting stuck with this, and brokerage firms and those kinds of things, and they're having to write them off saying, geez, this stuff is uncollectible.
Right. Right, which is too bad for them, but the reality is people are getting foreclosed on. Mm-hmm. It's middle income people that overextended themselves, wind up even, less middle class, lower class. Yeah. They have this debt, they have a foreclosure on their credit history. So in terms of dealing with them in the future, their lives are going to be harder to qualify for the next loan and stuff.
Yeah, whereas maybe some of the big banks will get bailed out by the federal taxpayers. Yeah. So they maybe they'll skate by. I don't know. Right. But that's the kind of thing that happens.
Right. And so far, I think this year, at the end of 2006, the indications were already there was going to be more foreclosures in U.S. history than ever. Even considering the fact that when Bush first took office in 2000, in his first 2 years, there was more foreclosures than in history since the Depression.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah, it's been just really a rapid run up. And I saw, you mentioned 2006 figures. I saw some figures for 2007. I don't have them in my head, but that trend is pretty up. Some of that stuff has to get fixed at the federal level, I would imagine.
Right. Well, the state does have a Department of Financial Institutions that regulates mortgage lending, credit unions, banks,
that's right.
payday lenders,
Yeah, that's
which
right.
9 years ago was illegal in this state to have payday lending.
Yeah.
As another predatory
Can we
lending
talk
practice.
about that? Because you see those every place,
Yeah, that's
every
one of the
strip mall,
fastest growing.
every strip mall you go
Yeah.
to has a payday loan place. And what a terrible indictment of our society that people are so economically vulnerable that you can't even make it to the next payday. You have to take out a loan to cover you for a few days till payday. What are we doing to our economy, and what are we doing to our people? So what else can you tell us about those payday loan predators
Well,
You're looking at me, but you know more.
that you can say politely on TV?
Well, again, it was illegal in this state, and it still is illegal in a number of states. And over the past 3 or 4 years, there's been some active work to try to regulate payday lenders. And we have found that the legislators, it's kind of a difficult concept because the reality is people use payday lending, but they don't really look at, because they have no other alternatives, like what alternatives existed before payday lending was legal again in this state. Banks had little programs, little lending, credit unions did little loans to people. And so payday lenders have been able to scoop up that whole market and make it seem like it's really needed, and the payday lenders are just there supplying the demand. And so legislators have been reluctant to actually step in and regulate them and bring down their annual interest rates from nearly 400% down to a regulatable amount of 18% or something.
There's another issue that you're interested in, and it has to do with food stamps and qualifying. Food prices have been one of the very inflationary parts, partly because so much of our food is dependent on oil in terms of the fertilizers and pesticides and transportation and everything else. People who get food stamps are having a hard time making ends meet. And do you have recommendations for improving the food stamps here?
Yeah, there's current legislation that would just increase the gross income eligibility, because working families are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet, and food is such a basic necessity.
Yeah. So the gross income, you're talking about how much income you can have and be able to qualify. So, if it's tight, you have to be extremely poor, and you're suggesting limiting that or lifting that a bit,
little,
so that
just so that more families can access food.
Yeah. Okay. And is there legislation on that, or do you expect
Yes,
some?
there is.
Okay.
Representative Pettigrew is leading the charge.
Okay.
He's another hero fighting poverty in the legislature. There's a few of them.
Good. I would imagine that most of the people watching this program have never heard about individual development accounts, and that's something else you're working on?
I think anytime that you can put more money into the pockets of these families that are struggling so hard to make ends meet, it's a good thing. And
The
individual development accounts are a great way to do that. They're savings accounts that are matched by organization, the government, by some entity. Currently in this state, the Housing Authority runs IDAs for their tenants and matches a savings account. So after somebody's been on housing for a few years, they have a good-sized savings account that they can use to either put a down payment down on a home. I know many families have bought in homes that way and are now in their own house, or start a business, or go to school, get an education. And so they're limited in the ways that you can use them, but they can certainly help people get out of poverty.
And there's something else called an opportunity grant that you know about, and what's that?
Well, both the IDAs and the opportunity grants exist, and current legislation is being proposed to just expand them. Opportunity grants are financial aid for families. The way that financial aid currently works is that it's created for individual students and doesn't take the needs of families into account. And there's childcare expenses, there's living expenses that are in excess for families. And so opportunity grants would make it so that more people could go to school, go to community colleges, and provide that financial aid to do that. And Representative Kinney passed that last year, the year before, and has been trying to expand it and make it available to people. And it's a great program that it exists in other states and just really opens the door to higher education.
I want to ask you about one more thing that I think would probably something that most viewers don't think about until we mention it, and then they'll go, oh yeah, sure, of course, and then we'll get back to some more of Pat's priorities. And that's that a car in modern society is just a necessity if you're going to get to a job. So much housing doesn't live on bus lines or walking distance of a job.
Well, if you have kids, you have to take them to daycare or school and get to
so poor people who have a car are really being squeezed, and you've been urging some way of having low-cost car insurance for low-income people.
Well, car insurance is a legal necessity.
It's required by law now.
It's required by law, and yet there is no way to access it if you are living on, the bare necessities. Like, I mean, what are you going to choose, car insurance or dinner on the table?
Yeah.
And so people are forced to drive illegally, which can be very expensive, or they're forced to make choices that they shouldn't have to make, and just having that access or they're forced to not drive, which then limits their ability to work and all kinds of things.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that would not have occurred to most people until you point that out, and they go, oh, sure, yeah, that's, it's a necessity.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. Pat, when we were preparing for the program, you mentioned the Washington Families Fund. Can you tell us what that is?
That's one of those incentive programs to keep people in housing, and it's sort of emergency funding and weatherization funding that the legislature gives to help families and even homeless families get into housing or just stay in their rental housing by providing utility subsidies or rent subsidies and other such things. And already the legislature has passed the first, because of all the flooding and the subprime market thing, when the legislature first met, their first action session was they passed a number of things related to low-income housing. And the Washington Family Funds was one of it. It's Senate Bill 6335. The governor had previously, right before the legislature met, pledged $6 million in her budget to that amount, and the Senate went ahead and made it $8 million. And that's still realistically a drop in the bucket for what everyone needs, because that has to be renewed continually every year. And along with that is also the THOR program, THOR, which I can't remember what it stands for, but it's another sort of emergency funding for people to get into rental housing, to get off the streets. And the legislature, the first day that they met on the floor, the House of Representatives passed that with the $6 million price tag on it.
Okay. You mentioned the flooding that's occurred in parts of this county and some nearby counties. It's a big experience for those who are directly involved. And when we were preparing for the program, you were talking about, we were talking on the phone a few days ago, and you were talking about like people's attitudes or consciousness raising about the realities of those economic hardships. Can you tell us some more about that?
Yeah, what I think the legislature has done, and the governor took it up and went running with it, is also related to post-Katrina emergency response. And I think the entire nation was disappointed in, to say the least, in President Bush's response to Hurricane Katrina and rebuilding that city, that when we experienced floods, the governor was on it right away, dedicating emergency funding to replace people's lost food, due to the flood and some lost wage money and things like that. And she was going to every county, declaring state of emergencies, petitioning the federal government to reinvest in our communities, to rebuild those homes and those farms and those businesses. And I think that in the past, the difference has been if you're a homeowner, we'll give you money, or a low interest loan to rebuild your house, your own house. But this time, the need for emergency housing, for temporary housing, has widened to even accommodate renters. Like we need, it's recognizing that the private rental marketplace has a role to play in the sort of housing safety net. Like when your house gets flooded, where are you going to go? You have to go do a rental for a month or two. And so that's why they were putting this money into those emergency funds to get people into some emergency housing to stabilize them until the federal money comes due, and things like that. So I think it's been a consciousness changing that in the past it's been like, homeless people live in an emergency crisis every day. They don't have a house. When the flood happens, when most floods happen, it's like, oh, poor homeowners are like destitute now. But I think this time, along with the 10-year plan to end homelessness and everything, it's just a recognition that, oh, homelessness happens to everybody.
Yeah, it's the whole continuum. It reminds me of the notion that some people who are advocates for people with disabilities talk about when they talk about those who don't have disabilities as the temporarily able-bodied, because any one of us at any moment could have a stroke, a car accident, whatever, that all of a sudden, changes our lives completely, or a flood.
Absolutely.
And so I would hope that there's been a lot of consciousness raising, I think, and a lot of volunteer work of people going to help folks who've been flooded out. I would hope that people would recognize, as you were pointing out, that the need exists not only to homeowners, but people who are renting, or, if you're poor and you lose your stuff, you're really wiped out because you don't have that much to start from.
Right.
Yeah, you don't have those other reserves.
Well, I think it's great for people to be confronted with that notion. We go to the welfare office every week and share information with people.
Your organization, Power.
Power does. Share information with people about their rights and talk to people. And for everyone there is a unique story about why they're there. And I think that it's a really educational experience, because I think that we tend to say, oh, well, that would never happen to me. I'm not like those people. But, you don't know what's going to happen, like you said.
Yeah, I've read reports and things about, who is it that's homeless. And there are a lot of people who become homeless after they have some kind of maybe an on-the-job injury, or a medical emergency or something, and it wipes out, a serious medical thing, might wipe out your savings. You might lose your job out of it because you can't be working, and all of a sudden, here you've been middle class, you go through a bankruptcy because of medical bills, because we don't have universal health care in this country, and then you lose your house and so forth, and you end up homeless, and you had been, a middle class or even upper middle class, and it can happen to anybody. And so, the concerns that we're talking about relative to poverty and homelessness, that's, we're all in that risk pool.
Everyone's concerned.
Right. And I think the way the legislation is set up, our current laws, is with an understanding that the marketplace will take care of itself. Like it's been going the way it's been going for 100 years, and most people make it. And I think it takes a crisis sometimes for us to reevaluate, oh wait, this is an obvious gap in the safety net, so we need to address it, like the issue of the foreclosures with the subprime thing. It's like, oh, a lot is on the line right now.
Well, and the market doesn't take care of it because the people with a whole lot of money and the corporate entities are all trying to take away the regulations so they can do as they darn well please. So they do that, and then they get themselves in a bind. And so we do need those regulations. We do need those laws for the well-being of the whole community.
I agree, and we need more.
Which speaks to the need to speak up.
Yes.
Those regulations didn't happen because people with power and money thought it would be a good idea to
Yeah,
put
right.
those regulations in there. That happened because
Yeah.
the people,
Yeah.
all of us, and more and
Yeah.
more spoke out and said, "This is
Yeah.
a requirement. This has to
Yeah.
happen."
Yeah.
This is-
And so that's the grassroots advocacy, the kinds of things that you're both working with, where we got to get the word out, and this program, if we can get the word out to more people to be aware of the issues and develop some empathy for people in a different situation from ourselves, a single parent with kids, or a person who ends up getting squeezed badly and needs some very low income housing, or a renter who is having a hard time finding a suitable place at a suitable price.
Well, and as hard as it is to do when you are struggling to survive, that single parent needs to call her legislators or his legislators, usually it's a her, and say, we need these legislation and we need them now. The TANF grant hasn't been increased in 15 years. That's a travesty. It's not that people need to do it for them, it's that people need to voice their own experiences and learn how to do that. And the legislature is very accessible.
In this state, the Washington State Legislature has a good record compared to others around the country for being very open and accessible and user-friendly. There are some that are just very standoffish, very push the people away kind of.
There's a public
attitude.
Hearing for every bill that's passed, and anyone can testify at that public hearing. So if you hear an issue on this program tonight that you have a story about, it's those personal stories. It's the people that are living under these laws that legislators really like to hear from, and it makes a difference.
In the early 70s, I worked 2 years for DSHS in public assistance offices elsewhere in the state, and man, the people just had such stories. And there was one guy that he was older, but not old enough to qualify for really old age assistance, but he was old enough that he was still technically employable, except nobody's going to hire a guy who's about 60 and not in great shape, but not disabled. He just didn't have anything. He was getting just minimal. Food stamps didn't qualify for any medical. And one time I saw him come in, and his tooth was missing, and he said that he had this toothache, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. He had no medical assistance, and so he finally grabbed a pair of pliers and pulled the thing out. And he says, "What the hell kind of a country is this where a guy can't get his tooth taken care of and he has to pull it out with a pair of pliers?" And so after I moved to Olympia so I could keep an eye on DSHS and keep an eye on the state legislature, especially on issues related to poverty. And so the lobbyist from the Seattle Urban League asked if I would testify about some of the realities that I experienced on the inside of DSHS to some state House and Senate committees. And so I was able to tell that story about that guy. But otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to travel from Everett, where he was living, to Olympia to testify to a hearing.
Well, that's
that
a
just
good
was
point.
beyond his means.
But he could write his legislator.
He could. If
Could send a
But
picture.
I think there's
the
also
point is,
this-
it's a story. It's a personal
Yeah.
story, and he wasn't there, but I could at least tell them
That's great.
that this guy had said, "What the hell kind of a country is this where, you can't get your teeth taken care of and you have to pull your tooth out with a pair of pliers?"
And I think one of the other isolating factors of people is they're shamed into taking responsibility for that. Like it's not his fault.
Yeah.
And it's good to have a sympathetic ear, like through DSHS or through social service agencies or advocacy organizations to say, no, it's not your fault. There's a bigger picture here.
Yeah.
And the legislature could benefit from hearing your story because that's the tip of an iceberg.
Because our culture blames people for being poor. I mean, there's a whole strain of theology that says if you're rich, that's proof of God's blessing on you, and if you're poor, that means that God's mad at you for something. And I mean, our whole culture, the whole capitalistic system, blames people who, for whatever reason, get squeezed out.
And it hasn't always been like that. If you look back historically, after the Depression and during the Depression, people were angry because they felt like if they didn't have a job that paid a living wage and was dignified, and if they weren't able to make a living, a dignified living in this country, that the country failed them, not they failed the country.
Yes.
And how that shift has come about so that people, you know, feel that shame, feel that they've done something wrong. You know, we need to move back to our country owes us a owes us a chance.
Well, let's talk for a bit about each of the groups that you work with, because in each case, Power and the Thurston County Tenants Union, you're working with people from the grassroots to get their needs met and also to advocate for improving the system. So tell us just a bit about Power as an organization. It's Power stands for Parents Organization for Welfare and Economic Rights?
Almost. Parents Organizing for Welfare.
Organizing, not organization, organizing. Okay.
And we have worked in this community for 10 years as ROC, the Welfare Rights Organizing Coalition, and many, many people know us as that and are becoming accustomed to our name change. And a lot of people wonder why. And if they want to hear the whole story, go online and look at the June edition of Works in Progress, and the whole story is there. And it's a great example of what to look for if you are involved with a nonprofit and how to keep something like that happening to your nonprofit. But we are rebuilding. We haven't stopped doing the work. We've continued.
Yeah, you still got your office at First Christian Church, which has been a wonderful organization at 7th and Franklin.
Yeah,
it's a church that really cares about people and has been very generous in supporting you folks. You still have the same phone.
Yep, we still have the same phone number.
And the same email.
Well, no, not the same email. Our email is now welfarerights at riseup.net.
That's right. Riseup.net.
And the First Christian Church has been incredible to us. They've given us office space for 10 years. They're currently hosting Camp Quixote in their covered parking lot, which is a real blessing to the folks living in tents.
Yeah, keeps them out of the rain and the wind. Yeah. So you mentioned a few minutes ago that Power goes out to the Public Assistance Office to connect with the clients and let them know what their rights are and to be a resource for information, make sure they have, you're kind of a check on the system too, because you monitor, is the state actually doing what the law says? Are people being treated with dignity? And you're monitoring that stuff, and then you issue reports.
Yeah, if we change the laws for the better, but the state agencies aren't following those laws, then that's a problem too. And we've seen that happen. We also provide witnesses, kind of patterned after the Witnesses for Peace, welfare witnesses, to anyone who's going into the office and just wants to take somebody with them in the hopes that they might be treated better that way. Also in the hopes that this person who may not be a welfare recipient or have been a welfare recipient, you know, might have a chance to learn a little bit about what it's like. And so while they're with that person, they're a silent witness. But after they leave, they can certainly talk about what that felt like. Of course, you know, keeping that person's confidentiality, but.
And the office phone for you folks is?
352-9716, and that's a 360 number. We also have a toll-free number, which is 866-343-9716.
Okay, thanks. Let's talk a bit about the Thurston County Tenants Union. You've got an office space downtown.
Right.
And the location is?
203 East 4th Avenue, Suite 412. It's on the corner of 4th and Washington Street.
And you're just up a bit.
Right. Fourth floor.
From the ground level. But you're accessible during office hours and?
Yeah, people contact us renters. We answer questions of renters throughout Thurston County, most of whom live in the city of Olympia because of the population of Olympia. And they come in person and ask questions, or they call us on our hotline, which is 943-3036. And we talk to people about how to get repairs done, what to do if they have an eviction notice, how to respond to an eviction notice, what to do about rent increases, Unfortunately, one of the things that I can't answer is when they come in and ask me, do I know of any good rentals or affordable rentals in the area?
Okay, so that's just beyond the scope of what you can deal with.
Right, yeah.
But you can provide some good practical knowledge that people may otherwise not know about what their rights are, how to.
Right, we're kind of a check on the system, but the system doesn't have any, it's not like a DSHS head that we can go talk
Yeah.
to. It's the free market.
Yeah, yeah. When we were preparing for the program, you mentioned efforts during the 1930s, the Great Depression. We talked about the Depression a few minutes ago. Do you have anything else you could share with us about insights or stories from the 1930s? Not that you were there at the time.
No.
But there are things we need to learn from.
Absolutely.
That people in our parents' generation or others may have experienced.
When FDR was making a bid for his first presidency, it was in the middle of the Depression, and there was a lot of outcry. Huey P. Long was running, Upton Sinclair was running. I mean, it was an amazing time, and so FDR managed to put together different proposals that he ran on in his first bid for presidency, and it was built upon past things that came out of crisis. And so one of the things that we had here in Washington, both to decry the problems of our own state, but also the country in the middle of the Depression, was a hunger march in 1932, which was they brought people, the unemployed, because there wasn't jobs. I don't know what the unemployment rate was back then. Mm-hmm. People were hungry. People were living in shanty towns. Mm-hmm. Olympia had a shanty town. South Seattle was a big shanty town. And it was just like people had to do something. And so they came to Olympia and marched on the legislature. And the legislature took emergency action to enact food subsidies for people and to deal with some other kind of tide people over until FDR's New Deal policies took effect. Because at that time, it was already known FDR had won, and it was that lame duck period, basically. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so just this year was the 75th anniversary of the original Hunger March. Oh. So I guess it was 1933. And this group I work with called Statewide Poverty Action Network does lobby days on Martin Luther King Day, which is a holiday, so poor people have the day off and they can often afford to take off work, because they're not working. And so so that's the idea of doing it then. And the first time happened to be on the exact anniversary of the Hunger March back in 33. So I've tried to keep that alive because a lot of the same issues they were talking about back then coming out of, or in the Depression, was food, housing, and some sort of income, whether it be a guaranteed job, a living wage, or something else so they could feed their families. That's what it was about.
Yeah. Well, and we often, when we talk about history, we often start with FDR passed the New Deal as if it just came out of nowhere. We don't talk about the thousands of people who marched on D.C. demanding an end to poverty. Right. And that's where it starts, because that would never have passed.
Yeah, there was all kinds of agitation for before then, people were organizing and saying we should have some kind of a federal pension for old people, because old people often were left with nothing. You get old and you got no income, and so a lot of agitation laid the groundwork for what became Social Security, for example,
right,
and all these other things, and a lot of those things are being rolled back by people who don't want the government to take care of people. I mean, not just your Hurricane Katrina example of an administration that doesn't want the government to take care of people, but other folks beyond that just as the free market, the free market extremists. So yeah, there are things that can be done through the legislature. We should mention again the www.leg.wa.gov would be the legislative website that is just richly informative, very accessible. You can enter in the bill number or the topic, and you can see the schedule. You can find out who your legislator is and what the legislator's phone number and office location, all that stuff. It's a great resource, and it needs all that citizen agitation to make the
Absolutely.
system go.
We encourage people to write their legislators several times during session, tell them what they need, send pictures of their kids, let the legislators see your
Yeah.
face, visit them, call them, so that they know that you're paying attention and that you're watching how they vote.
Yeah, you're working on a housing advocacy day for Thursday, February 14.
Right, Valentine's Day.
And you're working for a lobby day with your group for the following Monday, the 18th, which is President's Day.
We chose that, again, because it's a holiday.
Yeah, and people should realize that the legislature works even on those holidays. So they worked on
Right,
Martin Luther King's holiday, and they will be working on President's Day. They don't take the holidays off.
And ours is at our office at the First Christian Church, 7th and Franklin, at 10 a.m., and bring the kids, and we'll go visit the legislators.
Right. And what do you have planned?
And if people want to attend the Housing Advocacy Day and Ending Homeless Day, I think we combine the agendas of the Washington State Coalition Against Homelessness and the Low Income Housing Alliance to come together on one day. They could call me at my office or go to www.wliha.org.
And your office phone again in Olympia?
Is 943-3036.
Okay.
And we bring like 200 to 300 people every year from around the state to talk to legislatures. There's food. Last year we got ponchos that said "This is not a home" that we got to wear on the Capitol steps.
Very good.
And it happened to also be the launching day of the Camp Coyote Tent City.
Oh, yes.
And I was able to get people decided to forego their boxed lunch so I could take it down to
Nice.
Camp Coyote for people.
We're going to run tight on time, but I want to mention taxes. When we were preparing for the program, you mentioned that Washington State has probably the most regressive tax system in the nation. In other words, it's the tax system where poor people disproportionately pay way more than their share, and well-to-do people pay disproportionately less than their share. So tell us, we're running tight on time, but tell us just something about your concept of taxation.
Well, it's not probably the most regressive. It is the most regressive tax system in the nation. And yes, poor people pay a higher percentage. Sales tax is a regressive tax because everybody has basic necessities, but the smaller your income, the more portion of your income you're paying for those basic
Bar
necessities.
of soap costs the same whether it's a millionaire or a homeless person buying it.
Yeah, and one of the legislations that might help balance that up a little bit is there's a group of individuals working to create a state earned income tax credit. So along with your federal earned income tax credit return, you can get a small portion from the state as well. So we support that legislation.
Okay. I wonder, do we have a closing thought from each of you as we wrap this thing up?
Get involved.
We need more housing.
Okay, great. We want to thank Monica Peabody and Pat Tassoni. We want to just let you know again about the organizations they work with. POWER is the parents organizing for welfare and economic rights in Olympia, 360-352-9716. Email is welfarerights@riseup.net. Thurston County Tenants Union in Olympia, 360-943-3036. Email tctu@tenantsunion.org. And for information about a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change, and referrals to other great organizations and issue folks as well, you can contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 491-9093. You can visit www.olyfor.org. We're all one human family and we all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to work at it. And the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks for watching.
Mm-hmm.